This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. Now this week we're going to be talking about the Gorgons. Now the Gorgons are present in Greek mythology, and to a certain extent in Roman as well. We do see the stories both in, we see them in Hesiod, Homer, and in Ovid as well. We definitely see stories of the Gorgons. Now, probably a few years ago, actually, when I started this podcast, one of the first figures that I covered, or at least probably within the first 20, was the Gorgon Medusa. Okay, most people are very familiar with Medusa. But here what I'm doing is I'm actually looking at the Gorgons as a unit, or as a group, I should say, not maybe, although sometimes they're presented sort of as a unit. Because there's actually three of them. There's Stheno, there's Euryale, and then there's Medusa. Now, what's typically said is that Medusa is the one mortal Gorgon, and that the other two are immortal. And many reasons are given over time for why this is. You know, usually there's this idea that Medusa, she's in some way offended Athena, and Athena ends up turning her into a Gorgon. Now, the connection between Athena and the Gorgons is actually quite it's quite an interesting link that we're going to see between herself, Athena, and actually even Artemis as well, with these three women who are associated with the underworld. We have talked about the Grey Eye in the past. I believe earlier this year I did a podcast, might have been one of my first ones this year, on the Grey Eye, which are the three women who represent old age. Now, interesting how, first of all, we see the threeness here, okay? And again, I'm not totally wedded to the whole virgin maiden crone thing. I don't think, or, the kind of old theories about the mother goddess and this kind of thing. But nonetheless, it does seem pretty clear that we have a lot of cases where we see a triple aspect here. And it's interesting that with these feminine figures, we're only seeing them in forms of threes. Okay. And no, I don't think it's virgin maiden crone, but there's a threeness to it. We see it in Celtic mythology too, where things seem to, these figures seem to be presented in threes. So what I want to do in this particular episode is I want to talk about who the Gorgons are. Okay. Like, again, I've mentioned their names, but what their names mean. And there's really only one main story that is connected with them. I mean, they are mentioned in various places, but we'll talk a little bit about those connections. And then I want to get into some of the interesting symbolism, where the Gorgons fall into the whole. I'm going to call it the realm of the feminine, okay? Because there's different realms, and it's particularly in the way that they end up relating to themes having to do with love, or particularly male-female relationships. What kind of role they tend to have. They seem to in a certain sense be establishing boundaries with regard to men, the male gaze, and. And weirdly, they may have this almost, I don't know, there's definitely seems to be an element about them that reminds me of the Furies to some degree, because they seem to be these underworld figures that come in and that are there to represent some kind of a consequence for something, okay? And so I'm going to look at this. I guess what I want to do is kind of divide this into the psychological aspect of the Gorgons, like how we might look at it from a strictly, perhaps, psychoanalytic perspective. And then talking about the Gorgons in terms of their femininity. And there's an interesting article that I found that I'm going to read some of it to you about the Gorgons and how their representations changed over time. Because as we've said with other deities, there tends to be a change. Like when we were talking about the Rusalki or the Rusalka in Slavic mythology, they start from being some very, very terrifying figures to being something very, very beautiful. And we see a very similar trend happen with the Gorgons as well. So, so those are basically the two main things I want to talk about with respect to the Gorgons. I don't not necessarily want to focus especially on Medusa, since I've already done a whole podcast on her. So this is going to be more about the Gorgons as a whole. Okay, so I'm going to start with the definition of them from theoi.com, which theoi.com. Excellent resource, free resource on the web. Some annoying ads and stuff, but it is actually, it's not one of those homework helper sites. It is actually a legit collection of primary source material. There's like encyclopedic definitions, and then they also give primary source material underneath it. They quote it from the different places where this particular deity or figure is mentioned. So it says the Gorgons were three powerful winged daimons named, now remember what we said about daimons. Daimons are intermediary spirits. Named Medusa, Stheno, and Euryale. Of the three sisters, only Medusa was mortal. King Polydectes of Seriphos once commanded the hero Perseus to fetch her head. He accomplished this with the help of the gods, who equipped him with a reflective shield, a curved sword, winged boots, and a helm of invisibility. Okay. And mind you, these come from Athena, from Hermes, and they come from Hades. So these are his three helpers, and I think that's somewhat significant here. Okay. When he fell upon Medusa and decapitated her, two creatures sprang forth from the wound, the winged horse Pegasus and the giant Creosaur. Now, Creosaur, I'm just going to stop here and mention, Pegasus, of course, is the winged horse that we see in Greek mythology. I mean, I think Pegasus is a fairly well-known figure. Creosaur is a man with a beautiful boy with a golden sword. And some people have theorized that he is like that he might actually represent like a golden sheaf of wheat or something, that there may be that representation of this beautiful boy who, kind of springs up this way. And it says, Perseus fled with the monster's head in a sack and her two angry sisters chasing close on his heels. Now that's a part of the story that it is represented a lot in art, but that's not the aspect of the story that we typically see. Certainly Stheno and Euryale, once their sister's been killed, they do pursue Perseus to avenge her. But of course, in the different versions of the stories, one is that because he's wearing a helmet of invisibility that's been given to him by Hades, he can't be, he can't be seen. And, so they're not able to catch him. In other versions, it's Athena who actually stands between him and the other Gorgons. And Athena, it's interesting. And also, there seems to be this idea that the removing the head of the Gorgon was, something encouraged by Athena. So she was willing to help him in this quest. And then once Medusa, after he had brought the head of Medusa back to Polydectes, who he found was basically attacked his mother, tried to, as they say, marry his mother by force. Then he held up the head of Medusa to Polydectes and turned him to stone, because we know that is the quality of looking at Medusa's head, is that you will automatically turn to stone. Now, okay, but then what he does with the head is he gives it to Athena, and Athena places it on her aegis, or her shield. And apparently this was also a thing in battle. I mean, Homer mentions it. It's the idea of having this image of the Gorgon on one's shield is something that could strike terror into the enemy. Okay, so the Gorgon's face actually almost has I just literally just finished a book on the Morrigan, and and there's so many of those qualities that remind me of that. There's this idea that the terrible appearance, on the battlefield of this particular woman can strike terror in the enemy, has almost like a magical quality of, and certainly of freezing somebody, right? Somebody who's in the midst of action and then they're frozen with fear, okay, or they're paralyzed with fear. But Athena ends up placing the head of the Gorgon on her own aegis. The actual head is actually on Athena's shield. Now, okay, they're mentioning that the three Gorgons, or three Gorgones, were depicted in ancient Greek vase painting and sculpture as winged women with broad round heads, serpentine locks of hair, large staring eyes, wide mouths, lolling tongues, it's almost reminiscent of Kali there, right? the tusks of swine or boars, flared nostrils, and sometimes short, coarse beards. Medusa was humanized in late classical art with the face of a beautiful woman. In Mosaic art, her round face was wreathed with coiling snakes and adorned with a pair of small wings on the brow. Okay. So we have a number of characteristics to kind of deconstruct right away. Certainly, their appearance is monstrous. Okay, in the way that they're portrayed, at least originally. And certainly, if you're watching the YouTube version of this, I'm going to have some of those images where they're kind of shown with the serpentine hair and the boar's tusks, and these very kind of wide, staring faces. They have this, the whole idea of the tongue that rolls out too. I mean, there's it just seems like there's so many things we could take apart here, and but I'm gonna try to, summarize some of this from this article that I've looked at that I think is very helpful. And of course, the fact that there's like a short, coarse beard. We have seen this with other monstrous female figures in Greek mythology, particularly Mormo or Gello, who are portrayed as having testicles. Like they have a masculine component to them. That is, that makes them. It's like there's these brutish women who are appearing almost, that have this almost. It's almost a liminal quality because it's like they're female, but they're also male at the same time. Or some aspect of them is male. So it's very interesting. Now, the Perseus story is the only one that really specifically mentions all three Gorgons. Now, Stheno is a name that means strong. Okay, so when we talk about, the name literally refers to strength, and it's said that Stheno was able to kill, she was the Gorgon who had probably killed the most men. Okay. And yeah, they said she was the most independent and ferocious, killed more men than both of her sisters combined. Now, in Roman myth, she was transformed into a Gorgon for her relationship to her sister Medusa, who was, our word, by the sea god Neptune in this case. Now, okay, that's another thing. If we go back, who are their parents? Okay, I haven't talked about their parentage because that wasn't initially mentioned in this entry, but they are the daughters of Phorcys and Cato. Okay. And they're born in the caverns beneath Mount Olympus. Now, who are Phorcys and Cato? They are two sea monsters. They are monsters of primordial sea. Okay, and the Gorgons are their offspring. Well, actually, Phorcys and Cato have a lot of offspring, a lot of monstrous offspring, and the Gorgons are one of them, or I should say, three of them. So we've got this sea connection already. They're part of the primordial sea. And then who is the one who comes to, sexually make advances at them, but another god of the sea? Okay. Now, Neptune or Poseidon are not gods they're more gods of the, the sea, like, if we think of the Mediterranean or things like that. There's a difference in Greek mythology between the seas that, men typically, traversed back and forth, if they were doing trade or, whatever. Those seas are ruled by Poseidon. The primordial ocean, the primordial seas, that's more of something, what would have been considered the waters at the edge of the world. Okay. Those are different. Those are not Poseidon ruled. Those are, Oceanus, Tethys, Pontus, Phorcys, Cato, these are all, and those are all the progenitors of the nymphs and of the Nereids and other water spirits. Come from the primordial sea. So there's a difference between the two. Nonetheless, we see this. So you have this very strong sea connection. And the name Euryale, now, Euryale is supposed to mean, how do they define this name? There's I've seen another definition of it. Let me just see what it was. Wide stepping, thank you. Okay, so she's called, Euryale supposedly means wide stepping, but I've also heard it referred to, that it refers to being briny, okay, like the brine of the sea. So, and again, we've seen this with the gray eye too, almost this reference to the foam of the sea. And it's interesting that they are, the Gorgons, they're sort of a connection to the gray eye, because the gray eye also are connected to the sea. And are also, they're sort of showing you what they're connected to one of the ravages of old age. right? And the way in which age can devour us or destroy us. Euryale and Stheno, Euryale has just as Medusa is able to look at you and turn you to stone with her look, okay? You look into her face and you turn stone. Euryale has a voice, an incredibly horrible voice. And the cries of Euryale, which she was said to have made after Perseus killed Medusa, Euryale is, her bellowing cries are enough to make people, I should say, crumble. That apparently it's a sound so horrible that people could drop dead from it. Which again, when thinking about the Morrigan stuff, I'm like, that reminds me of Bave or Bove, the one crow aspect who supposedly, and Nevin, who is the the other terrible aspect or terror aspect of the Morrigan that is able to, on the battlefield, the cries are so, even before the battle, they create a cry so terrible that, you'll have 100 men drop dead before they even get up to fight. So, and I mention this not because those two are the same thing, but because we're seeing, there's if we look at this from the psychological aspect, daimonic figures are definitely figures connected to the unconscious. And they have to do with traits, qualities, or attributes, or psychological behaviors, or emotions, various things like this we see, or things that are able to disturb the mind. Let's put it that way. So for example, we see other daemons like mania, for example, or, who's associated with, one's associated with blind rage, that can be, and it's interesting because it's the Olympian goddesses, usually Hera or Athena, who set them in motion and send them to do their work. And Athena just seems weirdly connected to the Gorgons here. Now, Athena, of course, as we know, she's a very, very highly rational goddess, okay? She's a virgin, and she's associated with battle strategy. Certainly her appearance in Homer has always been one to support warriors in terms of strategy. And of course, because, having, in the same way that, two armies marching at each other, if we think about the Revolutionary War in America, the British Army was very hard to take down by the colonists if they didn't engage in guerrilla warfare. Okay, there's this idea of not following traditional rules of where you're marching at each other with your weapons or charging at each other with your weapons, but rather that you're hiding behind bushes and things. Strategy sometimes is the better way to win rather than just going into the direct attack. And Athena is certainly the strategy goddess, but she has this. She has this connection to the Gorgons, and, she helps Perseus get the head of Medusa, and, this head that is able to freeze, okay, to make people, just completely, just completely crumble. And when I think about the fact that it is Athena and Artemis who tend to make use of the Gorgons or at least there's aspects of the Gorgons that became part of Artemis. It's almost this idea of these, because both Athena and Artemis are virgin goddesses, okay? And, so they tend to represent this, almost, I don't really want to call it masculinized feminine because I do think that war aspect is a feminine thing, but it's more of this, the way that they operate is more, it's more within, it's not chaotic. Okay. They're very certainly strongly connected to order and to maintaining order. Okay. Even though goddesses like Artemis have really dark aspects, like, bringers of plagues and slayers of female children and things like that. But I think some of the other physical aspects of the Gorgons might be considered here. Now, what I've just said about Stheno and Euryale, I mean, that's really the maximum about what's been said about them. Medusa has always been kind of the star figure there. And but their initial appearance is interesting, particularly the fact that not only do they have snakes for hair, but they have boar's tusks. Now, the wild boar was an animal in Greek mythology that, among other representations, was said to be sent as a kind of punishment. Okay, that somebody would be attacked by a wild boar. I mean, certainly there were hunters who went out and hunted wild boar, and of course, when you think about the hunt in Artemis, you can see kind of a connection there. And so, with Perseus, taking the head off of Medusa, there's almost this idea of hunting the boar, so to speak. But it also makes me think of another story, because I think about a lot of the mythological figures who were killed by wild boar. The one who makes actually Atalanta, she's one of the ones who actually does manage to kill a boar. I mean, she's and of course we see Heracles. Also one of his labors involves a boar. But I think about Adonis, the story of Adonis and Aphrodite. And, this beautiful boy that was born from Myrrha, from a myrrh tree, who's taken, and Persephone and Aphrodite kind of fight over him, they both. So he ends up spending, some time in the underworld with Persephone, but he really likes the upper world, so he spends most of the year. I think the way it was that he was allowed to pick, he had to spend 3 months with Aphrodite, 3 months with Persephone, and the rest of the other 6 months of the year, he could decide what he wanted to do. And of course, he spent them with Aphrodite because he preferred the upper world. Okay. And Adonis, as you know, I mean, Adonis becomes almost a code word. If we say that a man is very Adonis-like, okay, a man who is very, very beautiful. And and he's very much beloved of Aphrodite. So he's very strongly connected to this element of love and of this beautiful manhood and this love and this lust, and this kind of a thing, which are not things that are represented by goddesses like Athena or Artemis, who are virgins. They're not interested in sex. They don't get involved with that. But I think it's interesting that Adonis is killed by a wild boar. Okay. Eventually, that's what does him in. I mean, Aphrodite warns him, but he goes out to meet the wild boar and he loses. Now, if we think about the Gorgons as looking like boars, okay, or at least having the tusks of boars, there's certainly this very strongly, and if boars are sent as kind of almost challengers or punishers, this is like an unconscious challenger or punisher. Here you are, you're the beautiful man, you're living the beautiful life, it's all about, love and enjoyment of life, and then the wild boar comes in, You're put in conflict with the wild boar. You're a hunter because that's what, that's part of what you do. But so there's also the element there of, destroying the beautiful young man in the same way that one who gazes at Medusa turns to stone, or the one that hears the cries of Euryale will, just completely collapse and disintegrate. I mean, truthfully, none of this is limited to men. As far as we know, if you encounter either Medusa or Euryale in this sense, and we don't know how Stheno kills people. It doesn't actually say how she does it, just that, well, she's very strong, so maybe she does this through brute force. I don't know. Or maybe they all have elements of being able to turn people to stone. It's just not been established anywhere. But nonetheless, this idea of turning a man to stone, I mean, we feel like this has a lot to do with the male gaze, or the way in which, it's almost like a reflection back of the way in which men might be able to turn women into objects. Now you have these women who turn men into objects, or just otherwise, destroy them. And so the idea of Adonis being destroyed by a boar, and you have these 3 women who kind of look like boars, I feel like there's a connection there to whatever that psychological daemon is. Okay, that that the 3 Gorgons, just as the Furies, are there to establish and set some kind of boundaries. And in the case of the Furies, it usually has more to do with ancestral ties. So, for instance, they pursue Orestes because he commits matricide. I mean, killing your mother is, you're going to have, the fury of the underworld, unleashed on you for doing that. Even though in his case, he was stuck. If he didn't kill him, then he would have been in trouble for not avenging his father. So, he was in a difficult position. But nonetheless, there's this idea of, these certain boundaries that be established. You don't do anything, the Furies probably also would have been punishers of things like incest within the family and so forth. Like, it's not, they're maintaining these natural boundaries. Heraclitus saying if the sun stepped an inch out of its path, the Furies would push it back. There's the idea that they're these underworld, these kind of daemonic forces, but they're part of what keeps nature going the way it's supposed to. And if things go wonky, then they're going to you're going to either feel their wrath, or they're going to come in and they're going to put a stop to it, or they're going to punish it in some way. So it makes sense that the Gorgons, who are also creatures, they again under the sea. This is very much underworld kind of imagery. The underworld is portrayed as either being in a far western land, or underneath a cave, or underneath the sea, or just under the ground. But typically you enter the underworld through a cave, and oftentimes the Gorgons are seen along with Kerberos as being guardians of the entrance to the underworld. So to me, there's almost an element there with Adonis. It's like Adonis is, Aphrodite, he's got Aphrodite wrapped around his finger, okay? She's the goddess of love. She's deeply in love with him. But now he's facing that sort of Chthonic feminine. He's facing the wild boar. And that wild boar is there to challenge, that other aspect of him. And he loses, Of course, he's resurrected by Aphrodite in the form of the Adonis flower. Okay, she takes some of his blood and she makes it, into. So this is actually the beginning of the mythology. And those of you who happen to be my myth students, you always get this wrong on the exam. I think out of 35 people, only 2 people ever get it right. But it's a dying and resurrecting vegetation god myth. Okay, the idea that the hero of the story dies and is resurrected as some aspect of nature. They come back as a tree or flowers, or there's something that's where their immortality is. They return, and of course the flowers die, and then they come back again. So there's this kind of cyclical nature to it. But yeah, this idea of Adonis killed by this wild boar, I feel like it's you're being attacked by this force, and this is another aspect of the force that the Gorgons represent. Because and if you think about all of these feminine figures as either punishers or representing something that we're afraid of, and those two things kind of go hand in hand, because they make up part of what we think of as conscience. Okay, why you don't do certain things, why you the fearfulness of the feminine. I feel like the Gorgons almost embody that kind of, that fear of the feminine that's going to destroy you in some way. Like either, your gaze upon the woman is somehow going to do you in, or, like I said, these terrible kind of natural howling kind of cries that are associated with the underworld that we associate with Euryale, also have the potential to to destroy in the same way that we, like I said, we have seen in other mythologies, where, again, and then this is so you've got the two different aspects of men, right? You've got the man who is, sort of the beautiful, seductive lover type, who, is out for leisure and enjoyment. And then you have the man who's the hardened warrior. And you have these forces, both of these forces that can take them down, because they're both kind of on extremes. It's like, okay, yes, you're very beautiful, but how are you when you're confronted, with this force? How are you going to negotiate it? And, so, and then, when we think of things like the Furies as kind of, these punishers, they represent these roles that, make up, that are part of our psychological makeup and part of what we need to, just like we see other figures, Scylla and Charybdis, yes, they represent the terrors of the sea, but again, they're always connected with the sea. They're connected with the depths. Okay, it's not really an accident that we talk about the collective unconscious as being in a depth. Okay, that you're confronting, being swallowed by the whale or by the sea monster, or you're confronting something in the depths. They're part of those forces that you confront in the depths. And these forces, now, if we think about them from a psychological perspective, as we mentioned, the idea of turning someone to stone, there's Heinrich Fiers's Jungian Psychiatry is a book where he talks about this extensively. He calls it the Medusa effect. And it's a kind of psychosis that occurs where the person, usually like very extreme forms of depression are this type of a thing where you are just absolutely paralyzed. There's no, it's not even about being happy or sad. You're just immobilized. Anybody who's gone through clinical depression knows that it's just, there's literally no motivation to move on anything. And so they're calling that a condition of quote unquote being turned to stone. So to a certain extent, it represents that kind of a force. And of course, the wailing of a figure like Euryale, has many possible things, but there's a fearfulness to that, that what those cries represent. Those are cries that, represent doom. They may represent grief, the kind of keening cries that people might make at when somebody, when they die, and that was considered to be a cry that helped lead the soul to the underworld. Okay, so all of these are connected sort of with death, with depression, with all of these kinds of things that we don't deal with in our day-to-day conscious life on a regular basis. We don't spend our time. If you walk around interviewing people about death, they're going to be like, ugh. Like nobody walks around thinking about this. We don't tend to be confronted with issues of mortality and so forth, until, like, if somebody close to us dies, or something happens, or there's a mass shooting, or there's something where we start to think like, oh, wow, my life could end at any moment, But typically speaking, we push that to the unconscious. We don't think about that. And so it's interesting that they represent these kinds of forces. And we also got to think about Medusa's children, too. She gives birth to a winged horse, and she gives birth to a beautiful golden boy. Okay, they come out of her head when, spring from her head when her head's chopped off. There's a fair amount of symbolism to that as well. Like, okay, and then there's the symbolism of the horse as well that also we can get into here. Horses being associated with Poseidon, but again, horses have a very strong underworld connection. We've talked about in the Demeter podcast about Demeter Erinyes, the furious Demeter who appears as a horse. So there's this strong connection of horses not only to the underworld but also to the Fury, and in Greek mythology certainly they are ruled by Poseidon. So let me at this point talk a little bit from this article, and the title of the article is "A Hideous Monster." It's by Olga Zolotnikova, I think is how you say her name. Did the Western Greeks alter the concept of the Gorgon? Okay, and this is from, let me just quote my source here. I think it's a chapter called The Artistic Influence of Western Greece. And the original source is, the book title is Philosophers, Kings, and Tragic Heroes, Essays on Images and Ideas from Western Greece, edited by Heather Reed and David Tanasi. Okay, so it's Parnassos Press. So this is, so that's my source that I'm quoting here. Okay, so first they talk about, Olga talks about the Gorgon in the early myths. She says, the available evidence related to Gorgon should be briefly surveyed. The earliest mentions of Gorgon are found in the Homeric poems Iliad and Odyssey, which are dated back to the 8th century BCE. Their Gorgon is referred to as a dread monster whose head, by itself, is in Hades. According to the Iliad, the custom of representing on shields the head of the Gorgon, the dread and awful with grim eyes glaring terribly, already existed at the time of the composition of this poem. However, the Homeric poems do not contain any explanatory myth related to Gorgon and her dreadful head existing by itself in the underworld. This strongly suggests the theme of Gorgon was well known to the 8th century BCE Greeks, and the short mentions of Gorgon's head in the poem did not require explanations. Apparently, the mythic tradition regarding the Gorgon implied in the Homeric poems sorry, I just lost my spot here. It was quite old and therefore may be traced back as far as the prehistoric period. The first known narration of the myth about Gorgon occurs in Hesiod's Theogony, written around the beginning of the 7th century BCE. According to Hesiod's version, representing mostly the Dorian Boeotian tradition, there were 3 Gorgons who formed a kind of family. They were sisters, daughters of the sea deities Phorcys and Cato, and lived together somewhere in the far west. 2 Gorgons called Stheno and Euryale were immortal and forever young, but the third one called Medusa was mortal. She probably was a maiden too. Poseidon mated with her in a soft meadow amid spring flowers. Okay. Hesiod did not mention specific details related to the appearance of the Gorgons. Perseus, an Argive hero, killed Medusa for unspecified reasons and cut off her head. The winged horse Pegasus and the boy Creosaur came out of the neck of the decapitated Gorgon. In the Attic Ionian myth, the killing of Medusa, Gorgon, by Perseus seems to have been interpreted quite early on as an act favored and supported by Athena. On Proto-Attic amphora, which are vases, from Eleusis, dated back to 675 BCE, the goddess was represented as staying between Perseus, who runs away with the head of killed Medusa, and her two sisters pursuing him. The episode of the pursuit of Perseus by the two other Gorgons, omitted in the Theogony, would have been imagined as a necessary, quite exciting part of the story of the decapitation of Medusa, already in the first half of the 7th century BCE. Representations of Gorgons running after Perseus appear at that time not only in Attica, but also in the Peloponnese. That is, for example, on a Corinthian tripod vase relief from the Argive Heraion, dated from 650 to 625 BCE in Magna Graecia. Okay, so it says the Gorgons, the sisters of Medusa, were represented as monstrous female creatures with snakes either growing from their necks and heads, as on the Eleusinian amphora, or held in their hands, as on the reliefs of the above-mentioned Corinthian vase. Okay, so she's talking about certain pieces of art here. In the first part of the 6th century BCE, the author of the poem The Shield of Heracles, who imitated Hesiod, expressed in quite powerful words the monstrous appearance of Medusa's sisters. Two serpents hung down at their girdles with heads curved forward. Their tongues were flickering and their teeth gnashing with fury, their eyes glaring fiercely. It's not difficult to presume that in the 6th century BCE, this mythological portrait of Medusa Gorgon resembled the description of her sisters as was given by Pseudo-Hesiod. So she goes on to mention how, Perseus kills Medusa, how Athena attaches it to her aegis, and it says, this version explained to 6th century BCE Greeks the association of the dreadful monstrous face with the image of Athena appearing with the Gorgonion on her shield or on her breast. Now, he says, by the beginning of the 5th century, the most popular version of the archaic myth about Medusa Gorgon was a combination of the Hesiodic, especially preferred in Argos, Corinth, Boeotia, and Cycladic islands, and that of the Attic Ionian tradition. And according to this version, this is the, and Pindar briefly mentions it. So here's the bullet points. Medusa Gorgon was a monstrous and extremely dangerous female. Her hair was made of serpents, her eyes turned the beholder to stone. Perseus, the son of the Argive princess Danae by Zeus, killed Medusa Gorgon with the help of Athena and Hermaeus, cut off her head and escaped from her monstrous sisters, who pursued him. Already dead, the Gorgon gave birth to Pegasus, a beautiful white-winged horse, especially linked to Corinth, and Creasor, a young hero with a golden sword. Perseus returned to the island of Seriphos, where he left his mother, and turned the island's king Polydectes to stone by showing him the head of Gorgon, because Polydectes tried to marry Danae by force. The head of Gorgon was presented to by Perseus to Athena as a thank offering. Okay, so those are the bullet points of the story. So she talks about these appearances, and so we talk about this monstrous Gorgon. They may have snakes on their belts, on their hair. They may be holding it in their hands. They appear with like I said, these wide faces, boar's tusks, lolling tongues. They're terrifying in appearance. Okay, so now she talks about the transformation. She said, around 490 BCE, Pindar in the Pythian Ode 12, written for Midas from Acragas, is quite surprisingly, as it might appear, described Gorgon Medusa as beautiful or as having nice cheeks, presumably on her face and not elsewhere, but who knows. Although the poet could not avoid mentioning such traditional characteristics of Gorgons as fierce ones and maidens with horrible snaky hair. About 10 years after this ode, representations of nice-looking Medusa and her sisters appear in art, with the main evidence coming from Attica. A new detail of the myth is traced from the mid-5th century BCE onward. Perseus supposedly killed Medusa while she was asleep on a meadow. Around 460 BCE, Aeschylus, after his visit to Sicily, wrote the play Phorcides dealing with Perseus's exploits. The play is lost and the details are not known, okay? But she talks about a relief here from 450 to 425 BCE. Nice and young-looking winged Gorgons, sisters of Medusa, each with a snake curling around on her hand, pursue Perseus while their decapitated sister falls on the ground. Pegasus and Creasor, both just born, are near the body of their mother. So she talks about these different icons of the beautiful Gorgon, okay, and how they appear. So, beginning of the 1st century CE, Roman poet Ovid, who had visited Sicily at a young age, wrote the poem Metamorphosis, and which he has a story about Medusa, who was originally a ravishingly beautiful maiden, the jealous aspiration of many suitors. Poseidon attacked her in Athena's temple, and the enraged goddess transformed Medusa's beautiful hair to serpents and made her face so terrible to behold that the mere sight of it would turn onlookers to stone. By the 2nd century CE, the idea of Gorgon's beauty appears to be deep-rooted in the mythological imagery of the Greeks. Thus, Pausanias, presenting his version, there, not far from the building in the marketplace of Argos, is a mound of earth where they say lies the head of Gorgon Medusa. After the death of her father, Phorcys, she reigned over those living around Lake Tritonis, which is also a reference to Neptune, going out hunting and leading the Libyans to battle. On one such occasion, when she was encamped with an army over against the forces of Perseus, she was assassinated at night. Perseus, admiring her beauty even in death, cut off her head and carried it to show the Greeks. Now that's interesting, okay? Also, the presence, this is just a tiny detail, but the fact that she is in Libya. It should be noted that another monster from Greek mythology, the Lamia, it was said to be the queen of Libya, who had an affair with Zeus, and Hera punished her by killing her children, driving her mad, and having her seek out to steal and devour other people's children. I mean, that's the story of Lamia. But it's how these monsters all seem to be connected to Libya in some way. Maybe not all of them, but these other versions, connect them to parts of Africa, in a way that is, I don't know. It's a rabbit hole you could go down, I think. But it's interesting that, because Libya, actually it's Ethiopia that Perseus is said to end up being king of. Like Andromeda is a princess of Ethiopia. So a lot of these things, kind of happen, in Africa, which, I don't know. This seems to be part of the Greek sphere and the Greek world, but, I often do wonder why Libya in particular only seems to breed these kinds of monsters. I don't, although this, of course, is a much later, like now we're talking 2nd century CE, not BCE. We're talking hundreds of years after the original story might have been told. And then, of course, we have the traditional story from, Pseudo-Apollodorus in the 2nd century. Medusa was so beautiful, she challenged Athena to a beauty contest, which Athena won and then punished her by turning her into the Gorgon. We all have all of these things, There's a woman who challenges Athena because her weaving is better. And, of course, there's the contest, and then Athena turns her into a spider. That's the Arachne story, right? There's this motif of I challenged the god, and then the god punished me by Metamorphoses by Ovid. It's about being turned into something else. So it's, and of course, he turned her into a monster. And then, of course, Athena encouraged, Perseus to kill her. Okay, so so now we have this idea, just like we saw with the Slavic Rusalki, with this idea that you have these terrifying monsters that now are beautiful women, or beautiful women who are punished by being made into monsters, which seems to me to be not the same sense of the story. It's almost like, because remember, if I compare kind of the Adonis and the boar idea, we're not talking about the idea of the Gorgons representing an idea of the feminine that has to do with an aesthetic kind of a beauty, or with love in that regard. They actually seem to be bringers of, the equivalent of depression. They seem to be punishers, creating that, that fear of death. So there's this discussion of the dual nature of the Gorgon, just like we have with many, many of these dark feminine figures. Now, what she says here, she talks about a theory that the Gorgon was actually a Cretan Aegean goddess of wild nature, fertility, and reproduction, as well as a protectress of children and women. It says she had a primitive, terrifying appearance. In the beginning of the historic period, she was substituted by Artemis. Artemis also seems to be somebody who became a substitute for Hecate as well, or Hecate, and entered into the service of Athena and Zeus. So once again, now Gorgon, she may have been a goddess who now, that wild nature is now being controlled by Athena and by Zeus. Now, based on interdisciplinary research, this remarkable opinion can be developed further. Linguistic evidence indicates the Greek name Gorgo has secure Indo-European etymology. It derives from the Indo-European theme, I'm not going to say this right, it's probably Garrig or something like that, bearing such meanings as horror, dread, and terror or terrifying. The Old Irish adjective garg, meaning rough, fierce, frightful, or wild. The German adjective garstig, which is horrible, nasty, and foul, and the Slavic noun, I think this would be pronounced groha or groya, threat, horror, are among its direct cognates. The Indo-European origin of the name Gorgon gives grounds for associating her with the traditional Indo-European patterns. This leads to the conclusion that Gorgon, as an old Indo-European Balkan goddess, originally had a dual nature in conformity with the Indo-European principle of duality. One of her natures was terrifying, which made her able to repel the negative evil powers, and thereby to perform her main function to protect, which, by the way, we also see with Hecate. Because the Hecateion, I never quite say it right, the Hecateion, that people would keep in front of their houses was meant to protect them. There was this underworld goddess that was there to protect. And, okay. In her terrifying hypostasis, she would have been comparable to a wild female animal protecting her offspring, or to a tribal shaman performing some kind of primitive, frightening ritual. Her other nature was tender, kind, and beautiful as that of a loving mother. She would have been seen as gracious and benevolent goddess, taking care of all living creatures. Now, we don't really see any evidence of this in Medusa, but this is the theory. Gorgon, as goddess with a dual nature, ugly and beautiful, may be associated with a large number of mythological personages who demonstrate the ability of shape-shifting. Okay, now that's an interesting thing. They can change their appearance from monstrous to beautiful, and vice versa. The original idea of the double-sided appearance of Gorgon may be observed in representations with similar themes, in which Gorgon and nice-looking goddesses seem to be alterable in particular. Gorgon as mistress of animals on a 7th century BCE plate from Chimeros or Rhodes, and Artemis as mistress of animals are she's giving examples trying to say, connect these figures. So, okay, she says, the original dual nature of Gorgon, that is of a beast and of a nice human-like being, may have been reflected in the strong and commonly accepted belief that she was the mother of both a horse, Pegasus, and a beautiful boy, Creosaur. The appearance of Gorgon as half mare, half maiden, likewise seems to be expressive of the original perception of her dual nature, that of a wild animal, and another one as a nice-looking female. To underline the evidence that Gorgon was... all the evidence suggests Gorgon was an old Balkan or a Cretan Aegean Indo-European goddess with a dual nature. Okay, now, I don't know. That's a little... Possibly. It's an interesting theory, so I wanted to present that. But we have also seen this, and I think... because the Indo-European theory, that's Georges Dumazil. He does have some definitely interesting theories about the way deities are connected, not only from the Greco-Roman area, but also from areas in what would have been Persia, Mesopotamia, and also in India. And and certainly linguistic theories are interesting. But as we have noted with a lot of these goddesses, it's not so much that they have a dual nature; it's that when we're talking about these kinds of figures, and again, I'm also not really convinced by the idea that Gorgon was somehow a nice fertility goddess. That she was really kind of, she had a side to her that was nice. No, the dark goddesses, their quote unquote nice side is the one that protects. This is a force that can destroy you, and so this is a figure you would want to propitiate and call upon. If you're trying to destroy somebody else, or if you're trying to protect yourself, or you're seeking protection from somebody who you think is trying to destroy you. So Gorgon is, I feel like the Gorgons, again, they represent this kind of a force that is paralyzing in some fashion, and and obviously, again, strong enough to kill men. So I feel more strongly that they tend to represent this kind of psychological force, and that I don't think a dual nature there is proven, but as I have said in many places before, if they are actually some representation of an archaic Earth Mother, the Earth Mothers were not sweet and kindly. They're just not, because nature, while nature has a beautiful side to it, it's also not sweet and kindly. Just witness earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, natural disasters, or even just things like drought, famine, the way in which you can be attacked by wild animals. There's poisonous plants. I mean, there's a lot in nature that is terrifying and that you have to be wary of. Okay. and our consciousness itself has many things we have to be wary of too. It's not, which I think we frequently disconnect from nature. That's the way that we think about it, but it's really not that disconnected. We just choose to ignore, our instincts and things a lot of the time. So anyway, this is kind of an interesting exploration of Gorgon. The background's interesting. The fact that she is another one of those figures that went from being monstrous. I mean, she never totally lost her monstrous nature, but like even in more modern conceptions of Medusa, in your Percy Jackson, or in she's still shown in many cases as being a beautiful woman of some kind, but she's got the snaky hair. And if you look, if you look directly at her, you will turn to stone. But it ends up taking on a different meaning when now you're talking about this beautiful woman who's either was very vain, and this is her punishment, which is the way that and her punishment is from Athena, rather than being a force, a paralyzing force that is actually used in Athena's service. And it's really a paralyzing psychological force. Which would make sense for Athena to use something like that in warfare, because she is more about strategy. The strategy, it's not just about like who has the biggest weapons and who can go after and stab the most people or whatever. It's about more than that. It's about how do you psychologically mess with your enemy too. So there seems to be an element of that here. So I think to try to turn Medusa into this kind of mother goddess figure, I think it's more of over time people are trying to I think as the perception of the feminine becomes more because by the time these stories are written, you're moving into the Christian era, and you're moving into this more this view of the feminine that is more compartmentalized, okay, which because you see it. Speaking of language, within Latin language, the fact that everything had to be gendered according to according to sex. So if you had, nouns that are, I think the example frequently given is deus. Deus is a male noun, right? It's, second declension, Latin noun. And it's, but if you're referring to a goddess, they would use the term dea, okay, which is actually turns it into a first declension noun. And feminizes it. Okay, so in other words, if it was referring to a female, even if it was a masculine word, you had to feminize it. And so this is kind of a mindset that seeks to separate the sexes, and it may be more that the Gorgon now, as something female or feminine, has to kind of be shoehorned in, or has to match this idea of femininity. Okay. Terrifying femininity, but it's different because now this is not about these are these formidable forces of the unconscious that challenge men or that challenge our romantic notions of things. Instead, now she's a vain woman who challenged Athena. And whenever I have students write about Medusa and tell me that story, I'm like, it's not really the story of Medusa. I mean, or even the story of the Gorgons. I feel like you have to look at the Gorgons as a unit. And, as this kind of trio that represents this kind of psychological angst, this grief and potentially depression. And they challenge these are the things that come in and challenge our notions of, our romantic notions of things, the rose-colored glasses that we might wear when we are dealing with things. Because, depression, as awful as it is, and naturally, and of course, anybody suffering from clinical depression obviously, takes steps to try to deal with that. There are certain types of depression that actually serve a function. It may be to make you stop, and it may literally get you to stop and drop whatever life narrative you have and pick up a new one. I mean, it allows you to take time out to heal, to reflect. Depression in a more positive sense. Yeah, so this is not, but Medusa ultimately is about a disconnect. It could go as far as a disconnect from the personality too. So that's far more serious, obviously, and or clinical depression in the sense of there's just no motivation to do anything, and that would be the more extreme form. But nonetheless, we have to look at why these forces exist in our psyche. or, or even we don't even necessarily need to know why. They're just there. And we have to, I think there's a lot in these stories about how we face them. I mean, Perseus manages to conquer the Gorgon by using, first of all, he's invisible, okay? So he's not challenging them directly, okay? And he's also using his shield as a mirror. So again, there's this idea of, using reflection to successfully negotiate that paralyzing force. You could play with this in a lot of different ways, but anyway, that's about all I'm going to say about this subject. Thank you again so much for listening. Next month I am planning to make a lot of big changes to my Patreon, which I will talk about on my social media, which is Chthonia Podcast, one word on Twitter and Instagram, mostly Instagram. I don't do a whole lot on Twitter, and 2 words on Facebook. And of course, my website is chthonia.net. Everything's going to be getting an overhaul in the next month. Now that I finished writing this book, I'm really going to be focused on Patreon memberships, extra content, classes, and things like that. So always feel free to leave me a comment and drop me a note. If there's something that I'm doing that you're interested in or want to know more of, whether you're watching this on YouTube, whether you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app, or following the link that I've posted somewhere. I'm always happy to hear from people and their comments and to know what people would like. And so Chthonia.net's the website. Patreon.com/Chthonia is my Patreon. And I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons who have stuck by me. And even those who haven't, people come and go for their own reasons. But thank you all so much again, and until next time.